Is my my machinery is switched on. My name is John Dobai, and as you see, I was born in 1934, and so I'm about the same age as your grandparents. I'll be talking for about an hour, at the end of which I'll be happy to engage in a discussion or answer all the questions you may have. I have given Mr. Cleary my card, which has my email address on, and if you have any questions later on, please feel free to send me an email. So the talk is divided into 4 parts. I will talk about the life of my family and I before the Second World War in the first part. And then I will hope to take you with me on a bit of a history lesson where I show you some of the history and the geography of the region, Central Europe, because it is the history and the geography that's had such a profound effect on how the history developed in the Second World War. And then in the third part, I'll tell you how the Holocaust years affected my family and I. And then in the fourth part, I will briefly tell you why I'm doing this. What is the point of coming along and talking to people about a subject that is so long ago, on the one hand, and so painful on the other. So, I was, in the Hungarian language, we put the surname first and the first name second. So when I'm in England, which is where I live most of the time, I'm John Dobai, and when I go to Hungary, I'm Dobai János. I was born in 1934 in Budapest, which is the capital of Hungary. And this is to show you that Hungary is right in the center of continental Europe. It's a landlocked country, and it's about 1,000 miles or 1,600 kilometers. Yeah. And by going to the airport up the road here, you can fly there in about a couple of hours. And to show you how it relates to the countries round about, can you see that dot? Well, you can, which is more than I can. But, well, I will tell you that in the south of Hungary are the former countries of Yugoslavia, that is Slovenia, Croatia, and Serbia. And in the southeast is Romania, including the area of Transylvania. We'll come back to that soon. And in the northeast is Ukraine, but before that it was Russia, then it was, before that it was the Soviet Union, before that it was Russia as well. And in the north is Slovakia, which was part of the country of Czechoslovakia before they split up. And in the west is Austria. And you see the Danube coming through Vienna, Bratislava, and then it forms the frontier between Hungary and Slovakia, and then it turns running south through Budapest, and through Serbia, going towards the Black Sea. And I'd just like to point out that this lake, which is about 100 kilometers long, but only about 3 or 4 kilometers wide, and very shallow, and it gets warm very quickly, so it's a beautiful place to have holidays, and you'll see some pictures of that. And here I am at the back yard of the house where I was born with my mother. And Budapest is made up of 2 towns, Buda on the western side, which is hilly and contains many historical buildings, and on the other side is Pest, which is the commercial industrial part of the town. And we were fortunate enough to live on the Buda side, on top of a hill, with lots of open spaces at the time, and it was a healthy place for children to be born because the air was better and places to play. And my father was worked in a bank. He wasn't a very senior person, but he walked every day from the top of this hill down to the bottom, where he caught a tram to his office and then came back in the evening. And in those days, parents were told that children should be in the open air for at least 1 hour a day. So there's snow on the ground, but my parents put me outside because that's what the doctors said. And that's the house where I was born. My parents rented the flat on the bottom, on the ground floor. And this photograph is more recent, so it hasn't changed very much in the intervening period. And here I am with my father on the shores of that lake I mentioned. And my father was a very good sportsman. He played football for a 2nd division team. He had an Olympic trial for athletics, and he played tennis in the Davis Cup. And so, because of this sporting activity, we spent a lot of our time in the open air. So my mother and I would go down to this lake, and my father would join us at the weekend. And here we are on the terrace of a rowing club, and we're about to go rowing on the Danube. My parents rowed, and I just sat there. And in the winter, if there was a good snowfall, it was an opportunity to go skiing. And so obviously as a child, I wasn't aware of the politics of Europe and what was happening. I was mostly interested in playing football, going on the Danube, and skiing, and so on. And as you see in that particular year, there was a rather good snowfall. And my parents found a place for me in a kindergarten, and I got to know other boys who lived in the area. And the big day, of course, arrived when we all went to school for the first time. And this is the school building, and it's virtually unchanged from the time I went to school. And it was, of course, a big change from kindergarten to primary school. And this was a school where it was co-educational, but the boys and girls were in separate classes. And here is a picture of the class. The lady in the hat is the class teacher, and the rather severe-looking man on the right is the headmaster, and the man in the middle is a Franciscan priest who taught us about religion. And this photograph was taken after a ceremony. It's a Roman Catholic ceremony when the young people go through the ceremony and are deemed to be members of the church. So these white suits were hired, candles were distributed, and so there we are. Now, of course, I have to explain, I've come to speak to you about the Holocaust, and why am I in a photograph in the back row there, in a Roman Catholic ceremony. Well, this is where we begin the history lesson. Hungary took part in the First World War as part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and it took part on the side of Germany. And of course, Germany and Austria-Hungary lost the First World War, and there was enormous social changes as a result of the vast armies not being much required anymore, the huge losses in men and in material. So there was a huge unemployment, social unrest, because some of that was fueled by the Russian Revolution, where the Communist Party of Russia was agitating for all workers of the world unite. So there was social unrest and political unrest in the whole of Europe. Now, Hitler was a soldier in the First World War, and when he was demobilized, he found himself allied to a smallish Bavarian political party called the National Socialists, which is abbreviated to the Nazis. And this small Nazi party tried to take over the power in Bavaria, but the police arrested this small group and sent them to prison. And while Hitler was in prison, he wrote a very long, turgid book called Mein Kampf, My Struggle, My Battle. And in this book, he put forward 4 major points. The first one was that Germany did not lose the war because of the superior armies of Great Britain, France, United States, and Russia. They lost the war because of sabotage behind the lines by they didn't get the support of the civilian population. And he said, and this sabotage from the civilian population was due to the Jews. So this, of course, was really quite well received by the Germans, because it removed the feeling of guilt from them. It wasn't us, it was all due to them. So, and the second point he made was that if our party gets into power, we can make Germany great again and establish new industries and cut down unemployment. And the third point he made was, since it was all the fault of the Jews, the Germans must do something about the so-called Jewish question. He didn't at that point specify what that might be. And lastly, he said that the Nordic people, the Germans, Scandinavians, are genetically superior to all other people. So this was the crazy racial theories. Now, about half of these boys came from Jewish families. Now, here we must distinguish between Judaism as a religion and being Jewish in the sense of race. So, my parents were not observant Jews. My grandparents were. My parents left it behind, which I'll explain later. So, and we were aware of the threat, or my parents were aware of the threat posed to the Jews by Hitler. So the parents of about half these boys decided to convert to Roman Catholicism. So they went down, not in an organized way, a couple of times to the local church and asked if they could change religion. And this wasn't, in some cases, you may think that to change one's religion is a serious step, but in those days, my parents were not believers. They didn't think that was a serious step. On the other hand, they did believe that perhaps if anti-Semitism develops further, then they and I would have a better chance of avoiding the effects of anti-Semitism by changing religion. So for the first 7-8 years of my life, I was a keen Roman Catholic, going to church, I was an altar boy, and I had no idea that I come from a Jewish family. Now, continue with the history lesson. Before the First World War, Hungary was the green area, but it was also in charge of the purple area. And the Hungarian government encouraged everyone to become keener Hungarians. So the Croats down here were encouraged to change from their own language to speaking Hungarian. Romanians in Transylvania, it was the same thing. Now, Hungary, as I said, took part in the First World War, and they fought against the Italians down here, and also against the Russians in the northeast. My father became an officer in the First World War and went off to fight against the Russians, and after 3 months he was captured and he was a prisoner of war for about 4 years in Siberia. But so Hungary lost the First World War, and at the peace conference led by the Americans, it was decided to form new countries. So maybe I can see that. Anyway, so at the peace conference, Slovakia was detached from Hungary and given to the new country of Czechoslovakia. That bit of Russia was detached, bit of Hungary in the northeast was given to Russia. This big area was given to Romania, and all this area in the south was given to the new country of Yugoslavia. So, at the peace conference, always the victors dictate the terms. Hungary lost over half its territory and a third of its population. And this was an enormous tragedy for the Hungarians. And furthermore, the Allies weren't very careful about drawing up the new frontiers. So a large number of people whose mother tongue was Hungarian found themselves in a foreign country. So in Slovakia, there were about 300,000 people whose language was Hungarian. There were about 300,000 who found themselves in Russia, and 1.5 million found themselves in Romania, and another 300,000 in Serbia. And this was a huge tragedy for the Hungarians. And in the subsequent years, the Hungarians decided they are going to ally themselves to any country who will promise to return those lands to them. And they found this. When they raised this question, Germany said, if you support us, then we will do our best to return those lands to you. Now I'd like to tell you what is the position of Jews in Hungary. Hungary had easy numbers to remember. Hungary, the population of 10 million, 500,000, 5% came from Jewish families. That is not only including religious Jews, but also people who came from Jewish families. And Jews were encouraged towards the end of the 19th century and beginning of the 20th to take part in Hungarian life in every way, except one. They were not allowed to buy land. The Jews have lived in Hungary for a couple of thousand years, and their fate in the Middle Ages and the 18th, 19th centuries was very similar to the fate of Jews in England, for example, where they were regarded as somewhat separate, and they were not always encouraged to take part in civic society. So the Hungarians, the Jewish people in Hungary, put a tremendous amount of effort into educating their children. And this is the result. You see that first line, it's orvos, it means doctor. So 5% of the population are Jewish, and yet 55% of doctors come from Jewish families. The next one is lawyer. 49% of lawyers come from Jewish families. Engineers, 30%. Merchants, 45%. People doing other commercial work, 75%. Accountants, 60%. Bank workers, 60%, and so on. So, in other words, almost the entire middle class of Hungary was formed people who came from Jewish families. Not that it made any, they weren't, the vast majority were not observant, they couldn't be, didn't wear different clothes, the vast majority didn't go to synagogue. But nevertheless, racially, they came from Jewish families. since all these people were very successful in their professions, it caused a certain amount of jealousy, which increased the underlying current of anti-Semitism. And I'm sorry to say that Hungary introduced the first anti-Semitic law between the wars. It was right at the top, 1922, when the government said that the proportion of young people going to university from Jewish families cannot exceed 5%. And that meant that a lot of this caused panic among the Jewish population, and there was a lot of emigration. People came to this country and to the United States. And Hungary's loss was the UK's and the United States' gain. And then, of course, there were huge anti-Semitic laws later, which we will come to. So in 1939, the Second World War breaks out by Germany invading Poland. And at the same time, as the Germans came in from the west, the Red Army, the Russian army, came in from the east. And this caused huge refugee flow through Hungary as people tried to escape from the war, and especially, the Jewish people were fleeing from persecution. And the Hungarian Jews were somewhat rather sniffy about the Polish Jews who were coming through, because they were very Orthodox Jews. They had big hats and dark coats, and they didn't speak Hungarian, they didn't speak German, they had their own language, which was Yiddish. But nevertheless, the Hungarian Jews did their best to assist the Polish people who were coming through Hungary. And for us, going to school, life didn't change. We went to school, we played football, and of course, we were not aware of what was going on. Sorry, I'm going too fast. But in 1941, everything changed, because on June the 21st, the Germans invaded Russia. And within a few weeks, a frontier incident was engineered on the Hungarian-Russian frontier, and Hungary was drawn into the war. And immediately, my father was called up as a reservist, and he went off to the Hungarian army, but a month later he was dismissed, because there was a law saying people who were classified as Jews could not be in the army. And this classification didn't relate to religion, it related to whether your parents and grandparents were Jewish. And we had identity cards which had a big letter saying ZS, which is the beginning of the Hungarian word for Jew. So racial discrimination was already well underway. People who were classified as Jews could not be university professors or lecturers or senior civil servants, so all these highly qualified people were simply sacked. So Hungary enters the war, and at first the German victories seem totally unstoppable. So, the German troops reached Leningrad in Russia in the north, Odessa in the south, and Stalingrad in the east, and right down to the Crimea. But in 1943, things turned. The Red Army reorganized itself and fought the Germans to a standstill at Stalingrad, and the whole German army had to surrender, which was an enormous blow to Germany. And this was a turning point there. And the Red Army started to push back the Germans. And the situation looked so serious to Hitler that he called on his allies, the Romanians, the Italians, and the Hungarians, to send soldiers to the front. Hungary sent 200,000 men to fight alongside the Germans. But this army was badly equipped, not very well trained, and the Russians recognized this weakness, and very quickly they surrounded this Hungarian army, and out of the 200,000, 120,000 were killed, injured, or captured. Suddenly, Hungary lost its appetite for the war. The government sent out secret messengers asking the Allies if they could change sides. But the Allies continuing these talks, when the German intelligence service got to know about these talks. So on the 19th of March, 1944, the Germans occupied the whole of Hungary. And within 2 days, a special detachment of the German SS arrived in Hungary, led by a man called Adolf Eichmann. Now, he was the most senior person in the army, tasked with carrying out the final solution. And that is the total annihilation of the Jewish population of the Western Europe. And by the time he arrived, he had dealt with the Jewish population of Poland, Czechoslovakia, Germany, Austria, part of France, Belgium, Holland, Yugoslavia, and Greece. Yes. I'm sorry you can't stay long. And within days, a huge raft of laws were passed. And one of the first ones was the requirement for everybody classified as Jew to wear a yellow star. Now, I wanted, although this picture was taken by a Russian army photographer after the end of the war, I wanted you to see what it was like to wear this symbol. And everybody over the age of 8, I was 10, had to wear it. You couldn't hold your arm like this. It had to be on display. And whenever you were outside your home, it had to be worn. And people had to wear, who were wearing yellow stars couldn't share the pavement with people who did not, who were Christians. So Jews had to walk in the gutter. And a huge number of laws were passed. Jews had to hand in their radios, their motor cars, not that there were many, bicycles, cameras, paintings, carpets, hand over their businesses, workshops, studios, without compensation. So it was an enormous change. And very quickly after that, just at the time when the invasion took place, it was a school holiday. And I met one of my classmates, and I said I was looking forward to going back to school. And he said that he was going to go back to school, but I won't, because his father told him that I'm a dirty, stinking Jew. So I rushed back to my mother, and that was when she had to tell me that we do come from a Jewish family. And this was a huge blow to me, because before that, I believed the anti-Semitic propaganda, that Jews were peculiar, and they were not clean, and they were money grubbing, and they were not patriotic, and so on and so forth. So I was bitterly upset. So there were these enormous laws, and we couldn't go to school either. Jewish children from Jewish families were not allowed to go to school. And the next order came was to leave our flat, and we could only take what we could carry and move into a larger house with other mothers. My father, around this time, was called up and sent to a forced labor camp because he was classified as a Jew. Fortunately, he was a fit man because of his sport, and also where he was sent was under Hungarian army control, so he had a reasonable amount to eat and was not seriously mistreated. But other forced laborers were sent to the Russian front, where they were badly treated by the Germans. And one of the worst things that happened to them, they were driven across fields so that their footsteps would explode landmines. And over 50,000 men between 18 and 45 died that way. And my father's camp was building an airfield for the German Air Force. And the next step was the deportation of Jews. And this is a photograph of a largest village where the people were told to report to the railway station with one suitcase. The suitcase was loaded onto a lorry and driven away, and they never saw those suitcases again. And when the administration was complete, these people were loaded onto a goods wagon, good wagons. How many people do we have here roughly? No, in this room. About 200? Well, let's say 200. That would be 2 small goods wagons. I had family who lived down here, And they were put onto, my cousin and my aunt were put onto a railway train there, and the train travelled for 3 days and 3 nights on this route. They left Hungary there into Slovakia, and they went to this place here, which was Auschwitz. And between April 1944 and the beginning of August, over 430,000 Jews from Hungary or Hungarian-controlled territory were taken to Auschwitz. And very few of those returned. A third of the people who were murdered in Auschwitz came from Hungary. And this is a list of the trains that went there. So as you see, there are 137 trains and over 430,000 people were taken away. So we were living in this large house with about a dozen other mothers and children. All the fathers were in forced labor camp. And when my mother tried to keep in contact with the brothers and sisters, and couldn't, the letters were returned, no telephone. She realized that something was seriously wrong, and she decided that she must take action because she thought that we are going to be killed. So she took off the yellow star from our clothes, acquired some traveling papers, and we went down to the country, and she handed me over to a peasant family. I can't tell you whether these people were on goodwill or whether my mother paid, but she handed me over so that at least my life would be saved. And you can imagine what it was like to say goodbye to one another. So for some weeks, I was down in the country, which was a nice place to be because there's more food there. It was more peaceful because Budapest was being bombed by the Royal Air Force. So it was a more peaceful place. But unfortunately, I caught chickenpox, and the peasant woman thought that I had typhoid fever and sent me back to my mother. My mother made another attempt to put me into a children's home, and there I became ill and was sent back to my mother, which was a piece of luck because 2 days after I left, the Germans took all the children from the children's home and executed them. So I was with my mother, and then the order came to form a column outside the house, just carrying what we could, and we were marched off towards a railway station to be deported. And on the way, there was some hold-up, so we were pushed into an apartment block, about 8 flats, and there were about 300 people there, so we were about 25 people to a room. And the situation looked so bleak that quite a few of the older people jumped off the roof because they thought our end was near. And we lived in this house for some days when my father appeared, because the fighting was approaching Hungary, and the commander of the camp where my father was said to the people, "The war is lost, I can't help you anymore, just go." So my father walked back about 200 kilometers to Budapest and managed to find us. Oh yes, I wanted to show you this. If you look at the 19th of May 1944, train number 16 took 3,000 people to Auschwitz. And train number 17 took 3,300, 18, 3,000, 19, 3,222. So in one day, about 13,000 people were deported to Auschwitz. And while we were in this apartment house, one day my mother was taken away like this, and I thought that was probably the lowest point, because my father was away and my mother was taken away. Fortunately, these women were taken to scrub floors in a barracks, so she came back that night. So my father appeared and immediately set about trying to find a way of saving our lives. And this is where this man comes in. His name is Raoul Wallenberg, and he was a Swedish diplomat, came from a very rich and influential Swedish family. And when he heard about the plight of people in Budapest, he volunteered to join the diplomatic service with the objective of saving lives. And he set about it by issuing these papers which announced to the authorities that the person whose picture and details are shown are under the protection of the Swedish government and is not to be harmed. So my father succeeded in getting these papers for the three of us, and also a place in a Swedish-owned house where there was a large Swedish flag outside, and the theory was that the Hungarian Nazis, the Germans, were not allowed to enter. So we found shelter there. It was a house with about 500 people in it. Most of them were in the air raid shelter because we were being bombed, not only by the Royal Air Force, but by the United States Air Force during the day and the Russian Air Force. And gradually, the fighting was coming nearer and nearer to Budapest. So we were in this house, and there was the air raid shelter was so full that my parents decided that we would be better off a bit upstairs. So there was bombing, shelling, and also there was very little food. This was November, December 1944. And there was no water, electricity, or gas. And most of the windows had been blown out by explosions. And even though the war was clearly lost, the Germans and the Hungarians, Nazis, believed that their fortunes depended on the extermination of Jews. And they were still taking Jews away by train, as long as the train lines were open. And afterwards, people were marched off towards the west on foot. And thousands died in the winter of 44 because of lack of food and shelter. And sometimes the death was not only organized, sometimes it was quite random. You see that boy there? He was a good friend of mine called Boris Ivan, and he was in a similar house to mine, and he stuck his head round the front door, and some Hungarian Nazis grabbed him and told him to drop his trousers. And when they saw that he was circumcised, they shot him. And they went away laughing that it's quite good fun to be able to kill people without any sanction. So this is a picture, I think it's probably a reconstruction, but of the Russians fighting door to door, house to house, they surrounded the whole of Budapest, after which, of course, no deportations took place. And we were starving, really, and my mother tried to organize a sort of soup kitchen, and around Christmas, a horse was killed in front of the house and was very quickly carved up for food. And finally, on the 13th of January 1945, a frightened young Russian soldier appeared. My father was sent for, because he could speak Russian, to explain that we were not Nazis or fascists, we were in fact victims. So that was the moment of liberation, but it was another 6 weeks before the fighting ceased. And the Germans blew up all the bridges of Budapest, and this bridge was blown up prematurely. That's why it's still got the trams on it. And in the last weeks of the war, the Hungarians decided that these protected houses by Swedes, by the Swedish flag, and the other nations who did the same, particularly successful were the Swiss and the Spanish, Portuguese, and even the Vatican. That there was nothing behind it. If they the Germans tore down the flags, then no, but they wouldn't be punished. So they started emptying the houses of Jews and taking them down to the riverbank and machine gunning them into the Danube. And where are you? Your colleague, he's gone, isn't he? Oh, you're there. Yeah. So these are bronze shoes to remember the people who were shot into the Danube in the last weeks of December 1944 and beginning of 1945. So it took until February that really we were freed. And in February, my mother and I went out to try and find other members of the family. And unfortunately, we found them all. But on the 17th of January, Raoul Wallenberg went off to Soviet headquarters to try and organize additional food supplies for Budapest, not only Jews but others, and he was arrested. It is not clear whether he was arrested because he was seen talking to German soldiers, officers who he was bribing and bullying to try and stop the killing, or whether he was a representative of the West. But he was arrested and has never been heard of since. The latest historical evidence suggests that he was shot on Stalin's orders in 1947. Nevertheless, he is a great man. There's a statue of him near Marble Arch in London. He is regarded as a righteous Gentile and commemorated in Israel and many other countries. And as we emerged from the building, there was this type of scene confronted us, and in addition there were hundreds of people hanging from lampposts where people took revenge on each other. But we really didn't know what happened until the camps emptied and the people started returning. We didn't know about gas chambers and people being shot and starved and drowned and beaten to death. And this is the partial table of the losses that the Jews of Europe suffered. Of course, Poland had the largest Jewish population and been occupied for a long time. 91% were killed. Hungary, 69%, and so on. But these are not the only losses. Let us remember the 300,000 gypsies in Roma who were killed. Trade union leaders, anybody who opposed the Nazi regime was exterminated. People who were physically, mentally handicapped were systematically murdered. Homosexuals were exterminated. 3,000 Catholic priests were murdered in Auschwitz, among others. So the total number is much larger. So now, briefly, we come to the last part of my talk. Why am I doing this? It is difficult to talk about this even after 7 years. Well, I come for a number of reasons. One of them is to remember the members of the family who were killed. We lost 2 cousins, 2 aunts, and from the wider family, 2 grandfathers. As these things go, it's a comparatively small proportion. But every time I talk, I remember them. And also, I can point out the the evils of racial and religious discrimination. And many of you come from families who recently or further back experienced some discrimination. And I think it is our duty to fight against this. As it happens, in 1956, the Hungarians rose up against the Russians and initially defeated them. And then the Russians came back to Hungary and reconquered it. And there was a huge exodus of refugees. And in 1956, I was a student, and I went off to be an interpreter. And about 30,000 refugees came to England, where they were welcomed with great kindness. I'm sorry that refugees are not so eagerly welcome today. So I would like to ask you not to be indifferent to any form of discrimination. This is a great country to live in, and we can make it even better if we do not ignore discrimination. Thank you very much.
Thank you, John. I believe we have time for some questions.
Yes, certainly.
Thank you. Yes.
Hello there, John. Just wanted, one of the things I just wanted to reflect on is that more and more as time moves on, we're probably becoming even more reliant on things like cinema. I just wanted reliant on cinema in terms of our recollections. I just wanted to know what you felt about some of the ways in which the Holocaust has been filmed, particularly by Hollywood. I think of things like Schindler's List. Have you seen that film?
Well, you're quite right. The last Prime Minister, David Cameron, actually established a commission to try and find ways of commemorating, making sure that the memory of the Holocaust does not fade away. And there are all sorts of technological solutions, such as recording our testimony with a hologram. We have been, of course, that is the survivors who speak, we've been filmed and we've been recorded, and all these things are available. And the Holocaust Educational Trust is doing its utmost to make sure that this is available to people like yourselves. I gave some information to Mr. Cleary about other ways that pupils here can be receiving information. Regarding Hollywood, it hasn't been a good experience for survivors. I'm conducting a vicious campaign against the boy in the striped pajamas, because it's a terrible thing. I will give Mr. Cleary a list of books and films which I think are better. No, I don't. How can you have Schindler's List where you show virtually no one being killed? So there are other books and films which are better. So people have used this event for almost commercial purposes. And the survivors had to fight very hard, for example, to stop McDonald's building an outlet on the edge of Auschwitz. So we obviously, as we get older, we get fewer in number. So we rely on you to find a place for us in your history.
Questions?
If you are shy, I can ask questions on your behalf. Other pupils would ask me about what I feel about the Germans. Well, I think hating people is very corrosive, so I don't. Obviously, you can't hate Germans. I mean, that would be absurd, since the vast majority of Germans have no direct experience, so I will not hate Germans. I fight very strongly against people called Holocaust deniers. You might find a film coming along in the new year called Denial, an interesting one to watch. And some of the books, if you have time. Read. Other people ask, am I religious? Well, I'm not. I call myself a humanist because I think together we can make a difference. I don't feel the need for a divine presence. And we can overcome many difficulties together. Do ask if you want to.
Well, maybe if you have individual questions, maybe on your way out, if you would like to ask John.
Of course.
And in that case, then we should leave it there. Thank you very much.
May I wish you a great future.